Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the Enron Scandal, where polished executives in expensive suits constructed an empire built entirely on lies, hiding billions in debt while ordinary people lost everything. No dark alley. No weapon. Just greed, spreadsheets, and breathtaking deception. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Opening meditation. There are crimes that happen in silence. Not the silence of an empty field at midnight, or the silence of a house where something has gone wrong. This is a different kind of silence. The silence of a closed door. The silence of a locked room. The silence of a digital file that travels invisibly across the world, from one screen to another, carrying within it something deeply, profoundly wrong. We live in an era where evidence can exist in the form of light. A captured image. A recorded moment. A fragment of the world preserved in pixels and data. And sometimes, that evidence is all investigators have. A face. A hand. A tile pattern on a bathroom wall. The weave of a shower curtain. The color of a towel. Sometimes, the smallest thing saves someone. Tonight, we are going to walk through a case that began with a video. A video that should never have existed. A case that sat, unresolved, in the public conscience of investigators and online communities alike, for years. People who had never met each other, who lived in different states and different countries, who spoke different languages, sat in front of their computers and tried, methodically, relentlessly, to find one man. They did not stop. And eventually, someone saw something. And made a call. This is the story of FBI John Doe 47. Part 1, the ECAP program and the world behind the database. To understand this case, you first need to understand the world that produced it. Not the world of the perpetrator, not yet. But the world of the investigators. The world of a program that most people have never heard of, that operates quietly, methodically, in the background of the most difficult work the FBI ever does. The FBI's Endangered Child Alert Program, known by its acronym, ECAP, was established for a singular, devastating purpose. It exists to identify unknown individuals who appear in child sexual abuse material. The program works by taking images and videos that have been recovered during investigations, extracting frames and photographs of unidentified perpetrators, and publishing them publicly. Not the victims. Never the victims. But the faces, the hands, the identifying features of the people who hurt them. The logic is both simple and heartbreaking. Someone out there knows who this person is. A neighbor. A coworker. A family member. Someone who sees a face they recognize and feels that cold, sickening lurch of recognition. Someone who picks up the phone. ECAP was formally launched in 2004, though its roots go deeper than that, back to the years when the FBI first began grappling with the explosion of digital child exploitation material that came with widespread Internet access in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The program sits within the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children unit, staffed by agents who are, by any measure, doing some of the hardest work in federal law enforcement. The psychological toll of that work is immense. The investigators who analyze this material, who spend their professional lives staring into the worst of what human beings do to children, carry those images with them always. Many require extensive psychological support. Many do not last long in the unit. Those who do are defined by a commitment that goes beyond professional duty. It is something more than that. Something harder to name. By the time John Doe 47 was added to the ECAP database, the program had already been responsible for the identification and capture of dozens of individuals. Each case followed a similar arc. Images were recovered. Investigators extracted identifying details. Profiles were built. Information was published. Tips came in. People were found. But not every case moved quickly. Some cases sat for months. Some sat for years. The ECAP database, at any given time, contains a number of individuals who remain unidentified. Faces that investigators have not yet been able to match to names and addresses. Cases where the tips have not come in, or where the tips that did come in led nowhere. Cases where the trail, for the time being, has gone cold. John Doe 47 was one of those cases. For a time. The numbering of ECAP cases is straightforward. As new unidentified individuals are added to the database, they receive sequential designations. John Doe 47 was the 47th unidentified individual to be added to the program's public-facing database in the particular series to which he was assigned. The number itself carries no special meaning. But it became, for the people who worked this case, a kind of shorthand. A way of referring to someone whose real name they did not yet know. Someone who had a face but, as far as the investigation was concerned, no identity. A ghost who had left behind only images. The images themselves told investigators a limited but important story. The individual in question appeared to be male. He appeared to be between approximately 18 and 25 years of age at the time the material was recorded. That estimated age range was significant, because it would later shape how investigators thought about where to look, what databases to search, and what kinds of records might be most useful in narrowing the field. April 2020. The world was in the early, terrifying weeks of a global pandemic. Lockdowns were in effect across much of the United States and large parts of the world. People were confined to their homes. Movement was restricted. The rhythms of ordinary life had been suspended. Schools were closed. Workplaces were shuttered. People were isolated, frightened, uncertain. And somewhere, behind a closed door, in a locked room, someone was doing something that had nothing to do with pandemic fear and everything to do with the particular evil that lives in certain individuals regardless of what the rest of the world is experiencing. The timing would later become significant in ways investigators were still working to understand. The pandemic period produced a documented surge in online child sexual abuse material. Investigators at both the national and international level noted the increase. Organizations that monitor the distribution of such material reported record numbers of reported files during the lockdown period. The reasons were multiple and grim. Increased time at home. Increased access to victims. Disrupted social structures that had previously provided some measure of protection. Overwhelmed law enforcement agencies focused on public health enforcement. It was, In the words of one senior investigator who spoke to a journalist about the broader trend, a perfect storm for the worst kind of predator. John Doe 47 was one face in that storm. Part 2, The Images and What They Revealed. What the FBI published was not the abuse material itself. That is never published. The images released to the public in an ECAP case are carefully selected stills that show identifying features of the perpetrator, face, body, distinguishing marks, while protecting the identity of the victim and obscuring any content that would constitute further harm. The FBI's media team works closely with investigators to determine exactly which images can be published and in what form. What the public saw in the case of John Doe 47 was this: a male individual of apparently young adult age. The quality of the images was sufficient to allow for a reasonably clear view of facial features. The individual had features that investigators believed were distinctive enough to be recognizable to someone who knew him personally. The photographs showed someone who, to an outside observer, might have looked entirely ordinary. Someone you might have passed on a street without a second glance. That is almost always the case. The faces that appear in ECAP profiles are not the faces of obvious monsters. They are ordinary faces. Faces that belong to people who hold jobs and drive cars and have conversations about weather and sports. Faces that sit across dinner tables from family members who have no idea. Faces that smile in photographs, that appear in backgrounds of other people's holiday snapshots, that belong to individuals fully embedded in the ordinary fabric of community life. That ordinariness is not incidental. It is central to how these individuals operate. The ability to appear normal, to maintain a surface of normalcy while concealing behavior of this nature, is a defining characteristic of a certain type of offender. It is not a mask worn occasionally. For many, it is the primary mode of existence. The behavior that defines them in the criminal context is, paradoxically, the thing they are most skilled at hiding. Beyond the individual himself, the images contain details of the environment in which the material was recorded. And it was these environmental details that would become the focus of one of the most unusual investigative efforts in the history of the case. The setting appeared to be a bathroom. Specifically, what appeared to be a residential bathroom, not a hotel, not an institutional facility, not a commercial space. The visual indicators of a private, residential bathroom were there for anyone trained to look for them. The scale of the fixtures. The arrangement of the space. The kind of wear and patination that comes with regular domestic use rather than the standardized, regularly replaced fixtures of a commercial property. The bathroom contained a shower curtain. A specific shower curtain with a specific pattern. Investigators and, later, the online communities who became engaged with the case, spent considerable time and effort trying to identify that shower curtain. Where was it manufactured? Who sold it? When was it sold? The logic was straightforward: if you can identify the exact product, you can potentially trace where it was purchased, which might narrow the geographic area of the investigation or provide leads through retail records. This kind of object investigation, sometimes called trace object analysis, is a legitimate forensic discipline. It sits at the intersection of product identification, supply chain analysis, and geographic profiling. A shower curtain sold exclusively in a regional chain of stores could place an investigation in a particular part of the country. A product that was discontinued in a particular year could help establish a timeline. A product that was manufactured for a specific market could help eliminate geographic areas from consideration. The tile pattern on the bathroom walls was another focus. Tile is, in some respects, even more durable as evidence than textiles. Tile patterns can be highly distinctive. Manufacturing runs for specific patterns are often limited. The combination of tile pattern, grout color, installation method, and the general condition of the grouting can, in the hands of an expert, provide information about when the bathroom was tiled and potentially about the kind of property in which it was located. Investigators also examined other background details, the color and quality of the paint on the walls visible beyond the bathroom, the style of fixtures, the type of lighting. Each detail was a potential data point. Each data point was a potential thread that, if pulled correctly, might unravel something. The challenge was that none of these threads, individually, provided a definitive lead. The shower curtain was of a type that had been sold widely enough to make exact source identification difficult. The tile was similarly unremarkable in isolation. The paint color told investigators nothing specific. The light fixtures were common. The overall impression was of a bathroom that could have been located in a significant percentage of residential properties across the country. This is the particular frustration of environmental detail analysis. When it works with extraordinary precision. But it requires either a highly distinctive detail, something unusual or rare enough to narrow the field dramatically, or a combination of multiple ordinary details that, together, produce something distinctive. In the case of John Doe 47, investigators and the online community alike found themselves working with details that were, individually and even collectively, common enough to make a definitive geographic identification elusive. They were not wrong to try. The effort was legitimate and the methodology was sound. It simply, in this instance, did not produce the breakthrough on its own. The breakthrough, when it came from a different direction entirely. Part 3, the online investigation, communities that would not let go. There is a phenomenon that has grown, over the past 2 decades, alongside the expansion of Internet access and online communities. It does not have a single, universally agreed upon name. Some call it citizen investigation. Some call it open source intelligence gathering. Some, more cautiously, call it crowdsourced analysis. Whatever you call it, the phenomenon is real, it is powerful, and in a small but significant number of cases, it has contributed directly to the resolution of criminal investigations that official investigators had been unable to close on their own. The case of John Doe 47 became one of those cases where the online community engaged deeply, persistently, and with considerable methodological sophistication. The primary community on the platform Reddit that engaged with this case was r/unresolved mysteries, a subreddit dedicated to unsolved cases of all kinds, disappearances, unidentified remains, cold cases, and, in a subset of threads that always carry a particular weight, cases involving crimes against children. The community is large, with membership in the hundreds of thousands, and its culture values careful, evidence-based discussion over speculation and sensationalism. Another community that became central to the investigation of John Doe 47 was r/TraceAnObject, a subreddit dedicated specifically to the identification of objects that appear in ECA-related imagery. The community exists in close relationship with the FBI's ACAP program, and its members understand both the potential value and the ethical boundaries of their work. They do not share or discuss the underlying abuse material. They work from the sanitized, publicly released images and focus exclusively on identifying the objects, the shower curtains, the tile patterns, the clothing, the furniture, that might provide investigators with additional leads. The members of these communities who engaged with the John Doe 47 case brought to the table a remarkable range of knowledge and skills. There were people with backgrounds in product design who could assess the manufacturing characteristics of the shower curtain. There were people with experience in interior design and home renovation who could analyze the tile and fixture details. There were people with skills in facial analysis and image enhancement who worked on clarifying the physical features of the individual in question. There were people who spent hours searching retail databases, discontinued product catalogs, and home improvement store archives. What united all of them was a single, unwavering purpose: to identify this individual. To put a name to a face. To give investigators something they could use. The process was methodical. In the early stages, members of the community shared observations and initial analyses. The shower curtain became a particular focus. Multiple members identified what appeared to be the general style and pattern of the curtain and began searching for matching products from a range of manufacturers and retailers. Some pursued American manufacturers. Others looked at imported products. Some searched discontinued lines. Others combed through archive pages on retail websites. The tile analysis followed a similar pattern. Members posted detailed observations about the size, color, pattern, and grout treatment visible in the images. Some cross-referenced these observations with product databases from major tile manufacturers. Others looked at regional suppliers. The search was painstaking and largely inconclusive in its direct impact, though it contributed to a growing body of community knowledge about the case. Members also analyzed the individual himself with considerable care. Discussions of facial features were conducted with respect for both the investigative purpose and the privacy of the victim. Members noted distinguishing characteristics that they believed might be recognizable to someone who knew the individual in a personal or professional context. They discussed what those characteristics might tell an investigator about demographic background, geographic origin, or other identifying factors. The community also discussed the timeline. April 2020. The early pandemic period. Members noted, as investigators had, the broader context of increased online child exploitation activity during that period. Some members attempted to use the timeline, combined with the environmental details, to narrow the geographic focus of the investigation. If the bathroom suggested a certain climate zone, based on the style of construction or fixtures common in particular regions, and if the timeline placed the material in April 2020, when lockdown conditions varied by state, might the intersection of those factors help narrow the field? It was painstaking work. It was largely inconclusive work. But it was not useless work. Because what it did was keep the case alive. It kept people thinking about it. It kept the name, John Doe 47, circulating in communities where someone who recognized the face might eventually see it. And that matters. Because the single most important factor in the resolution of an ECAP case is not sophisticated forensic analysis. It is not image enhancement technology. It is not object tracing or tile identification. The single most important factor is almost always the same thing it has always been in criminal investigation: a human being who knows something, who decides to come forward. The community kept the case visible. And visibility, in these cases, is everything. Part 4: The Profile of an ECAP Offender. Before we talk about what eventually happened in this case, it is worth pausing to understand the category of individual we are discussing. Not John Doe 47 specifically, we will come to specifics in due course. But the broader profile. The type of person who appears in ECAP cases. Because understanding the profile helps us understand both why these individuals are so difficult to identify, and why the communities that work to identify them do what they do. The academic and clinical literature on individuals who produce child sexual abuse material is extensive, and it is complex. These individuals do not conform to a single demographic profile. They come from every income level, every educational background, every geographic region. They hold professional positions and they work in service industries. They are, in the aggregate, a cross-section of the population in ways that consistently confound the expectations of people who encounter this research for the first time. What the research does identify are certain common characteristics, not of demographic background, but of psychology and behavior. The individuals who produce, as distinct from simply consuming, child sexual abuse material tend to fall into a smaller subset of offenders overall. Production requires access to a victim. It requires planning. It requires the sustained maintenance of a situation in which abuse can occur and be recorded. This is not opportunistic behavior. It is, in the clinical language of forensic psychology, predatory and organized. The age range attributed to John Doe 47, approximately 18 to 25 at the time of the recording, places him in a demographic that investigators approach with particular attention. Young adult male offenders who are already producing abuse material represent, in the research literature, a particularly high-risk category. They have not yet accumulated the years of concealment experience that older offenders often possess. But they have also not yet faced the consequences that tend to interrupt a pattern of behavior. They are, in a statistical sense, at the beginning of what, if uninterrupted, could be a long criminal career. The forensic psychology of this type of offender is also characterized by what clinicians call cognitive distortions, specific patterns of disordered thinking about victims, about the nature of the harm caused, and about the individual's own behavior. These distortions are not simple lies the offender tells to others. They are, in many cases, patterns of thought that the offender genuinely holds. They function as psychological insulation, allowing the individual to maintain a coherent self-image while engaging in behavior that would, if understood clearly, be entirely incompatible with that self-image. The production of abuse material introduces an additional psychological dimension. Recording the abuse is not simply a passive act. It is, in the psychological framing used by clinicians who work with this population, an act of assertion. It creates a permanent record. It produces something the offender can possess, revisit, and distribute. The production behavior is itself, in many cases, part of the offense, not merely documentation of it. It changes the nature of what is happening in ways that have significant implications for understanding the perpetrator's psychology. They are not invulnerable. The ECAP program exists precisely because they are not invulnerable. Because they leave traces. Because somewhere, in the material they produce, there is a face. There is a bathroom. There is a shower curtain. There is a tile pattern. There are the 10,000 small details of an ordinary life that, taken together, constitute an address, a name, a location. Every one of those details is a thread. And the investigators who work these cases, and the communities that support them, pull those threads one by one. Until something gives way. Part 5, The Investigative Machinery, How the FBI Works ECAP Cases. Understanding what happened in the John Doe 47 case requires understanding the investigative machinery that surrounds an ECAP case. Because while the online community was doing its work, the FBI was doing its own. And those two streams of activity, running in parallel, eventually converged on the same point. The third track is the human intelligence track, working with informants, cooperating witnesses, and community-level contacts who may have information about the individual depicted in the material. This track includes the public-facing elements of an ECAP case, the publication of images, the tip line, the community engagement, but it also includes a less visible set of activities. Investigators working human intelligence leads may approach individuals who have been identified in connection with the distribution of the material and ask whether they can identify the person depicted in it. They may work with community members in the geographic area where they believe the material was produced. They may, in some cases, approach known offenders within the child exploitation community whose knowledge of other individuals in that community may be tactically useful. The fourth track, which in the case of John Doe 47 was particularly significant, is the object and environmental analysis track. This is the work that the r/trace and object community was, in parallel, also conducting. Professional investigators have access to resources and databases that the public does not: manufacturer records, wholesale and retail distribution data, law enforcement databases of products that have appeared in abuse material in previous cases. They can approach manufacturers directly with legal authority to demand records. They can trace the supply chains of specific products in ways that go beyond what is possible through open-source research alone. These four tracks of investigation do not move at the same speed. Sometimes one track produces a breakthrough that renders the others temporarily secondary. Sometimes all four tracks stall simultaneously, and an investigation enters a holding pattern while investigators wait for new information. The ECAP program, by design, keeps cases active even during these holding periods. The public-facing profile remains accessible. The tip line remains open. The case is never formally closed simply because no breakthrough has occurred. John Doe 47's case moved through this machinery over the course of the months following his profile's publication. Investigators analyzed the digital properties of the material. They traced its movement through online networks. They worked their human intelligence contacts. They analyzed the shower curtain and the tile and the fixtures. They reviewed every tip that came in through the public line, assessing each one, following up on the ones that seemed most promising, documenting the ones that led nowhere. It was methodical. It was slow. And for a period of time, it was not producing results fast enough. But it was producing results. Part 6, The Year of Silence, when the case seemed stuck. There is a particular quality to an investigation that has not yet broken open. It is not the quality of absence, of nothing happening. There is always something happening. Tips are being assessed. Leads are being followed. Documents are being reviewed. Laboratory analyses are being processed. But it has a quality of containment, of potential energy that has not yet found its release. Investigators who work these cases know the feeling intimately. The sense that somewhere in the accumulated material of an investigation, the answer is present, waiting to be seen from the right angle. For the people in the online communities who had engaged with the John Doe 47 case, this period had a different quality. It had the quality of frustration. Of effort expended without visible result. Of returning, again and again, to the same images, the same details, hoping that fresh eyes or a new approach might produce something that earlier analysis had missed. Members of r/unresolved mysteries and r/trace and object periodically revisited the case. New members who had not engaged with it before brought new perspectives. Occasionally, a thread would emerge with what seemed like a promising lead, a possible match for the shower curtain, a tile manufacturer that seemed consistent with the imagery, a detail that someone had noticed that others had overlooked. These threads were pursued with care and energy. And, for the most part, they led to the same place, a narrowing of possibilities, a refinement of the picture, but not a definitive identification. This is the nature of crowdsourced investigation at its most honest. The communities involved in these efforts are genuinely trying to help. The methodology they employ, when done carefully, is legitimate and sometimes useful. But they are working with limited information, without access to the full investigative record, and without the legal authority to compel the production of records or the cooperation of witnesses. They can point a direction. They can identify a possibility. They cannot, in most cases, deliver a certainty. What they can do, and what, in the case of John Doe 47, they demonstrably did do, is maintain visibility. Every time a thread about John Doe 47 appeared in a subreddit, it was seen by however many members of that community were active at that time. Most of those members would scroll past. Most would read and move on. But somewhere in that vast readership, there was always the possibility that one person would stop. One person would look at the face in the published image. One person would feel that cold, sick sensation of recognition. The case was also, during this period, reaching audiences outside the Reddit communities. True crime content about ECAP cases had been appearing on various platforms, YouTube, podcasts, dedicated true crime websites. The broader true crime community, which had grown enormously in the preceding decade, had developed a particular engagement with ECAP cases. There was something about these cases that resonated deeply with audiences who were already drawn to the genre, the combination of evidence that was tantalizing but incomplete, the human cost that was profound but whose full dimensions were necessarily obscured by the protections given to victims, and the sense that the community itself could play a role in the resolution. The true crime community is not without its critics, particularly in relation to its engagement with child exploitation cases. Critics argue, with some justification, that the commodification of suffering, the conversion of profound human trauma into entertainment content, raises serious ethical questions. These questions are not easily dismissed. The people at the center of these cases are real. The harm they have experienced is real. The attention of a true crime audience, however well-intentioned, does not always translate into outcome improvements for victims. And the line between genuine investigative engagement and prurient interest is not always as clear as participants in true crime communities prefer to believe. These tensions are real. But they sit alongside an equally real observation, in at least some cases, including cases very similar in structure to the John Doe 47 case. The sustained attention of the true crime and open-source investigation communities has contributed to the identification and capture of individuals who caused profound harm to children. The moral accounting is genuinely complicated. It does not resolve cleanly in either direction. What it does resolve to, in the specific case of John Doe 47, is this: the sustained effort by multiple communities, over multiple years, to keep the case visible and to continue working its details, created the conditions under which the eventual breakthrough became possible. Part 7: The Tip That Changed Everything. The FBI's tip line for ECAP cases is maintained continuously. Every tip received is logged, assigned a tracking number, and routed to an analyst for initial assessment. Tips are evaluated according to a protocol that considers the specificity of the information provided, the apparent credibility of the source, the degree to which the tip can be corroborated through other means, and the operational priority of the case in question. Most tips do not break cases. This is not a reflection of the bad faith of the people who submit them. Most people who submit tips to law enforcement investigations are acting in good faith, based on a genuine belief that the information they have is relevant. But a tip based on a superficial resemblance, or on an association that cannot be corroborated, or on information that is too vague to be actionable, cannot, however sincerely submitted, provide investigators with what they need. The initial processing of tips is therefore a filtering process as much as anything else. Analysts are looking for tips that have the qualities that make further investigation worth pursuing. The tip that ultimately contributed to the identification and capture of the individual known as John Doe 47 had those qualities. We do not know, and may never know publicly, the exact nature of that tip. The FBI does not, as a matter of general policy, release detailed information about the sources of tips in child exploitation cases. The protection of those sources is taken seriously, both because of the potential for retaliation and because the ongoing effectiveness of the tip system depends on the confidence of potential sources that their information will be handled with discretion. What we do know is this: someone saw the face. Someone recognized it. And someone made the decision to come forward. That decision, the decision to pick up the phone, to navigate to the tip submission page, to type out what they knew, was not a small one. In cases involving child exploitation, the individuals who are most likely to recognize the perpetrator are often people in his immediate circle. Family members, friends, acquaintances. People who may have complex emotional relationships with the individual in question. People who may have a great deal to lose personally from making a report. People who may have to contend with disbelief from others in their community. People who may be frightened of the person they are reporting. The courage required to make that call deserves acknowledgement. Not praise in a hollow sense. Real, substantive acknowledgement of what it means to look at a face you recognize and to say, I know what this person has done, or I believe I know what this person has done, and I am not going to look away from it. That acknowledgement was, in fact, offered publicly. When news of the case's resolution began to circulate in the online communities that had worked on it, the reaction was layered. There was relief, profound, genuine relief. The frustration of years of inconclusive effort giving way to the knowledge that the case was closed. There was gratitude, expressed toward whoever had made the tip that broke things open. And there was, woven through everything, the other feeling that attends these resolutions. The feeling that comes from knowing why this case existed in the first place. From knowing what happened to make the investigation necessary. The person who submitted the original Reddit post noting the case's resolution was direct about it. They wrote with evident emotion. They applauded, literally, with an emoji that captured the gesture, the person who had identified the perpetrator. They noted the years of effort by the community. They noted the ongoing nature of the ECAP caseload, the other cases that remained unresolved, the other individuals who were still out there and needed to be found. They were right. The resolution of one case is a victory, and it deserves to be recognized as one. But the ECAP database, at any given moment, contains individuals who have not yet been identified. The work is not done. The communities that worked the John Doe 47 case have already turned their attention to the cases that remain. The investigators at the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children unit have already turned their attention to the cases that remain. This is the nature of this work. It does not end. It continues. Part 8, The Arrest. From tip to capture. When a tip in an ECAP case is assessed as credible and actionable, the investigation enters a new phase. The receiving FBI field office, which may or may not be the office that originally handled the case, begins the process of verification. The identity of the individual named in the tip is checked against available records. The individual's known addresses, employment history, and other identifying information are assembled from law enforcement databases and open-source records. A preliminary assessment is made of whether the individual matches the physical description of the person depicted in the published images. If the initial verification supports the possibility that the tip is accurate, investigators move to the corroboration phase. This involves obtaining additional evidence to link the named individual to the case. Depending on what the investigators have available, this may involve requesting records from technology companies under subpoena or warrant, subscriber information, account records, device data. It may involve surveillance. It may involve interviews with associates of the subject. It may involve digital forensic work aimed at establishing a connection between the subject's devices and the material that triggered the investigation. This phase of an investigation can move quickly or slowly depending on the strength of the initial tip and the availability of corroborating evidence. In cases where digital evidence is central, as it almost always is in child exploitation investigations, the ability to rapidly obtain and analyze device data can significantly compress the timeline between initial tip and arrest. The legal mechanics of an arrest in a federal child exploitation case are precise. Investigators must establish probable cause sufficient to obtain an arrest warrant, signed by a federal magistrate or district judge. The warrant is then executed, most commonly by a team of FBI agents who are trained in the particular dynamics of these arrests. These arrests are not conducted casually. The subjects of child exploitation investigations are considered to present particular risks, the possibility that they will destroy evidence if given any warning, the possibility that there are victims in proximity who may be in immediate danger, the possibility that the subject may attempt to flee or to harm themselves or others. The execution of the arrest in the John Doe 47 case proceeded along these established lines. Agents moved to take the subject into custody after the legal requirements for arrest had been met. The subject was taken without significant incident, at least, no incident that has been reported publicly. The subject was processed, and the formal proceedings of the federal criminal justice system began their course. Alongside the arrest, investigators would have executed one or more search warrants. The search of the subject's residence and, likely, any vehicles and storage facilities associated with him, would have been conducted with the particular thoroughness that child exploitation investigations require. Digital devices, computers, phones, tablets, external drives, any media storage, would have been seized and transported to the FBI's Digital Forensic Laboratory for analysis. The forensic examination of those devices is a complex, time-consuming process, and the evidence it yields forms a significant part of the prosecutorial case. The victim, or victims, of the crimes documented in the material would have been an immediate and central concern from the moment of the arrest. One of the first questions investigators ask in these situations is there a victim who needs to be immediately located and protected? In cases where the victim has been in ongoing contact with the subject, the arrest may create an immediate protective concern. In cases where the abuse occurred at a specific point in the past and the victim has since been separated from the subject, the nature and extent of the harm and the victim's current circumstances must still be assessed and addressed. The FBI's Victim Services Division is integral to ECAP case resolutions. Victim advocates and forensic interviewers, trained in trauma-informed approaches to working with child victims and survivors, engage with the case from the moment of arrest. The welfare of the victim, their physical safety, their access to support services, the management of the notification process and what it means for them, is treated as a priority equal in importance to the prosecution of the offender. Part 9. Inside the Psychology of the Predator, Understanding What Drives This Behavior. We have talked about the profile of an ECAP offender in general terms. Now it is worth going deeper. Because if we are going to understand this case, really understand it, beyond the sequence of events, we need to sit with the uncomfortable question of why. Why does an individual who appears, by all external indicators, to be functioning normally within society engage in behavior that causes this kind of harm? The answer, as with most profound questions about human behavior, is not simple. And the clinical and forensic literature that attempts to answer it is careful to resist the temptation of simple answers, because simple answers are almost never accurate, and because inaccurate models of why this behavior occurs lead to inadequate responses to it. What the research does establish is a set of factors that are associated, in varying combinations and with varying degrees of influence, with the development of sexually harmful behavior toward children. These factors include early exposure to sexually inappropriate material or behavior during the offender's own childhood. They include histories of abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual, that the offender experienced as a child or adolescent. They include developmental disruptions in the formation of healthy attachment relationships. They include particular patterns of cognitive development that are associated with difficulties in perspective taking, the ability to genuinely understand and feel the impact of one's behavior on another person. None of these factors is determinative. The vast majority of people who experience any combination of them do not go on to harm children. The presence of these factors in an offender's history is not an explanation that excuses the behavior. It is, at most, part of a picture that helps us understand how a person comes to make the choices they make. And choices is the right word. At every stage of a pattern of abusive behavior, there are choices. The choice to act on an impulse rather than to seek help for it. The choice to record rather than to stop. The choice to distribute rather than to contain. At each of those decision points, the offender had options. They chose the option that caused harm. The production of abuse material, the decision to record, reflects a particular psychological state that forensic clinicians have studied extensively. For some offenders, the recording is primarily about possession and revisitation, the creation of a personal archive. For others, it is about status within a community of like-minded individuals, the sharing of material within networks where it confers a kind of currency or standing. For others, there is a more disturbing dimension, the recording as an assertion of power and permanence over the victim. The material does not just document what happened. It is itself part of what is done. The estimated age of John Doe 47 at the time of the recording, 18 to 25, places him in a category that forensic researchers have identified as particularly significant. Young adult offenders who are producing material are typically further along a trajectory of harmful behavior than their age might suggest. The decision to record does not usually represent a first offense. It represents a point on a continuum that has been developing, in most cases, for some time. The implications for the investigation, and for understanding the full scope of what may have occurred, are significant. Understanding this psychology does not require sympathy for the offender. It requires only the intellectual discipline to look at difficult questions clearly, because the answers have practical implications. They affect how investigators approach these cases. They affect how courts think about sentencing and about the conditions of supervision for those convicted. They affect how treatment providers design interventions for those who seek help before they harm someone. They affect how families and communities might recognize warning signs earlier. The psychology of individuals who commit these crimes is not pleasant to examine. But turning away from it does not protect anyone. The protection comes from understanding. Part 10. The broader landscape, other cases, other faces. The resolution of the John Doe 47 case was a singular event, significant in itself, and deserving of the recognition it received from the communities that had worked toward it. But it is impossible to sit with this case for long without becoming aware of its context. The ECAP database, as it stands today, contains other cases. Other unidentified individuals. Other faces. The person who posted the announcement of John Doe 47's resolution on r/unresolved mysteries was explicit about this. They noted, with evident feeling, that there are more cases open. More individuals who have not been identified. More investigations that are waiting for the tip, the recognition, the phone call that will break them open. The post that celebrated one resolution was also, simultaneously, a call to continue the work. The ECAP database is publicly accessible. The FBI maintains it in a format designed for ease of public engagement. The images are searchable. The cases are individually profiled. The tip line is prominently displayed. The intent is precisely what it appears to be, to make it as easy as possible for a member of the public who recognizes someone to come forward. The breadth of the database is, in itself, a sobering document. Each profile represents an investigation. Each investigation represents at least one victim. The accumulation of profiles is a record of harm done, and of harm that continues to be done every day that an unidentified individual remains unidentified, free, and potentially still in contact with vulnerable children. The communities that work on these cases are acutely aware of this. The culture of r/trace and object, in particular, is built around an understanding that the work is not about individual cases in isolation. It is about the systematic application of analytical skills to a problem that is ongoing and that has consequences measured not in abstract terms but in the welfare of specific children. The community maintains a careful ethical framework that distinguishes its work from vigilantism or from the kind of irresponsible amateur investigation that has, in other contexts, produced tragic misidentifications and unjust harms. The distinction between responsible community engagement and irresponsible vigilantism is one that deserves careful attention. In the history of Internet-based attempts to identify criminal suspects, there are cases where community efforts have gone profoundly wrong. Where innocent individuals have been misidentified and subjected to public harassment or worse. Where the rush to solve a case has overwhelmed the care and precision that accurate identification requires. These failures have caused real harm to real people, and they serve as a sobering reminder that good intentions are not sufficient safeguards. The ongoing cases in the ECAP database represent, in a sense, the continuing mission of everyone who cares about this work. Investigators. Community members. People who read about these cases and carry the knowledge with them. The faces in that database belong to individuals who are still out there. And somewhere, for each one of them, there is a person who knows who they are. The only question is whether that person will come forward. Part 11, The Resolution and Its Meaning, What Happens After the Arrest. When the news of John Doe 47's capture filtered through the online communities that had worked the case, the response was, as the original Reddit post captured it, a complex mixture of emotions. There was the relief of resolution. There was the gratitude toward whoever had provided the identifying tip. There was the awareness, never far from the surface, of the victim or victims at the center of the case, whose lives had been affected in ways that the arrest and prosecution, however necessary and important, could only partially address. The federal prosecution of a child exploitation case is a lengthy and complex process. From arrest to conviction, the timeline can run to months or, in more complex cases, years. The prosecution must prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant committed the offenses charged. The evidence assembled by investigators, digital forensic data, metadata analysis, victim testimony, testimony from investigators, evidence regarding the distribution of the material, must be presented in a form that meets the evidentiary standards of a federal criminal proceeding. Federal sentences for production of child sexual abuse material are severe. The statutory minimums and guidelines ranges established by federal law for production offenses are substantially longer than those for possession alone. This severity reflects a deliberate legislative judgment that the production of abuse material, because it requires a victim and causes direct, documented harm, represents among the most serious categories of child exploitation offense. The sentencing phase of a federal child exploitation case also involves, in many instances, testimony or statements from the victim or the victim's family. This is among the most difficult aspects of the process for those involved. Victim impact statements require the victim, or those speaking on their behalf, to articulate the harm that was done to them, in a courtroom setting, in the presence of the offender. The psychological demands of this process are significant. Victim advocates and trauma-informed legal professionals work to support victims and their families through it, but the difficulty of the experience is not eliminated by support. It is only, at best, made more bearable. The conviction and sentencing of an individual like John Doe 47 does not undo what happened. It cannot. The material exists. It has been distributed. The harm it represents cannot be unmade. The individual who was victimized will carry what happened to them, in one way or another, for the rest of their life. The question of how they carry it, what resources they have access to, what support surrounds them, how the institutions that engaged with their case treated them throughout the process, matters enormously. The federal system's approach to victims in these cases has evolved significantly over the past 2 decades. The emphasis on victim-centered investigation and prosecution has grown substantially. The resources available to child victims through victim services organizations, through the Children's Justice Act and related funding streams, through specialized therapeutic programs, have expanded. This evolution reflects a growing understanding that the criminal justice response to child exploitation must be measured not only in convictions and sentences, but in outcomes for the individuals whose harm occasioned the investigation in the first place. This is not to say the system is adequate. The needs of child victims of sexual exploitation are extensive and long-term, and the resources available to meet those needs are, in many communities, insufficient to the scale of the problem. The gap between need and provision remains wide in many parts of the country. Closing that gap requires ongoing investment, political will, and public awareness of the scope of the problem. But in the specific resolution of the John Doe 47 case, something real and significant happened. A perpetrator was identified. A perpetrator was caught. The machinery of justice engaged. And whatever happens next in the system, the fundamental fact that this individual is no longer free to harm another child is a fact that carries moral weight. It matters. Even in a landscape where so much work remains. It matters. Part 12, Lessons, Legacy, and the Continuing Mission. We are near the end of this story now. But a story like this one does not end so much as it opens outward. It opens outward toward all the cases that are still active. Toward all the faces in databases that have not yet been matched to names. Toward all the children who have been harmed and whose cases are not yet resolved, or never will be resolved, or have been resolved in ways that still leave profound needs unmet. The story of John Doe 47 opens outward toward all of that, and it asks us to sit with it, honestly, and to think about what it means and what it demands. What are the lessons of this case? Not lessons in a tidy, listicle sense. Real lessons. The kind that come from spending time with a difficult case and attending carefully to what it reveals. Visibility is a form of protection. Not a guarantee. Not a panacea. But a real and meaningful tool in a landscape where perpetrators thrive in darkness and rely on concealment. The ECAP program is built on this premise. The communities that work ECAP cases are built on this premise. The true crime genre, at its most responsible, operates in alignment with this premise. Darkness enables harm. Light, however imperfect, however partial, however carefully managed, is a counterforce. The second lesson is about persistence. This case was not resolved quickly. It sat in the database. It was worked by investigators and by communities for an extended period without producing the definitive identification that everyone was looking for. At several points, it would have been easy, and understandable, for attention to drift, for the case to recede into the background of a database full of other cases, for the people who had been working it to turn their focus elsewhere. They did not. The investigators kept the case active. The communities kept returning to it. The tip line stayed open. The face remained visible. And eventually, the right person saw it. Persistence, in this work, is not a virtue in the abstract. It is a practical necessity. These cases do not resolve on schedules. The information that breaks a case open may take days to arrive or it may take years. The willingness to remain engaged across that entire timeline, to treat a case that has not yet broken as a case that has not yet broken rather than a case that will never break, is fundamental to the kind of investigative culture that produces results. The third lesson is about community. The online communities that work this case, r/unresolved mysteries, r/trace and object, and others, are not professional investigators. They are private citizens who have organized themselves, voluntarily and without compensation, around a shared purpose. They have developed methodologies, ethical frameworks, and cultures of practice that, at their best, make a genuine contribution to investigations that matter. This is a relatively new phenomenon in the history of criminal investigation. The tools that make it possible, widespread internet access, online platforms that support large-scale community organization, open-source information resources, digital image analysis tools available to non-specialists, are all products of the past 2 to 3 decades. The communities that have grown up around these tools are still evolving their understanding of how to use them responsibly and how to integrate their work with official investigative processes. There are tensions in this relationship that deserve honest acknowledgement. Law enforcement agencies have, at times, expressed frustration with amateur investigative activity that has complicated official investigations, compromised ongoing operations, or produced misidentifications with harmful consequences. These concerns are legitimate. The history of crowdsourced investigation includes genuine failures alongside genuine successes. The norms and practices that distinguish responsible community engagement from harmful vigilantism are not always clearly articulated, and they are not always consistently followed. But dismissing the potential of these communities entirely, in the light of what cases like John Doe 47 demonstrate about what they can contribute, would be a mistake. The relationship between official investigation and community engagement in these cases is worth developing carefully and thoughtfully, with attention to both its potential and its risks. The fourth lesson is one that sits beneath all the others, and it is the most difficult to articulate without either sentimentality or despair. It is about the children at the center of these cases. Every ECAP case has a child at its center. A real child. A child who was harmed in the most fundamental ways. A child whose harm was recorded and distributed in ways that compounded and extended the original injury. A child who exists not as a profile or a case number but as a person, with a name and a history and a future, moving through their life with the weight of what happened to them. The resolution of the John Doe 47 case is, in the first instance and in the most important instance, something that happened for that child. The perpetrator is caught. The harm cannot be undone. But the forward risk, the risk that this individual, free and unidentified, might harm another child, has been removed. And there is in that removal something that deserves to be named as what it is, a meaningful, consequential act of protection. We do not know the name of the child at the center of this case. We do not know their story, beyond what the investigative record necessarily implies. We know only that they existed. That they were harmed. That someone cared enough to pursue justice on their behalf for years, from within the official system and from outside it. And that, in the end, justice moved. Not perfectly. Not completely. Not in ways that erased the harm. But it moved. The communities that post on r/unresolved mysteries and r/trace and object know that the next case is already waiting. They have already turned toward it. The investigators at the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children unit have already turned toward it. The tip lines are open. The databases are updated. The work continues. Because somewhere, in the ECAP database, there are other faces. Faces that belong to people who are still out there. And somewhere, for each of those faces, there is a person who knows who they are. We hope they come forward. We hope they come forward soon. Closing meditation. We have been sitting with a difficult case tonight. A case about the darkness that exists in certain human beings, and about the remarkable, persistent, quietly heroic work of the people who refuse to let that darkness go unconfronted. It is not easy to carry these stories. They are heavy in the way that only true things can be heavy, with the weight of real lives, real harm, real consequences that extend forward in time from the moment of the original act and do not simply stop because the camera did. But we carry them because carrying them matters. Because awareness matters. Because the face that you might see in a database someday, the face that makes something inside you go cold and certain, matters. Because the phone call you might make someday, the message you might type, the decision you might face someday to come forward with what you know, all of that matters. The resolution of the John Doe 47 case tells us something important about what is possible. About what a determined federal investigation can accomplish. About what a community of persistent, careful, ethically grounded citizens can contribute. About what a single person, making a single decision to come forward, can set in motion. If you have information related to any ongoing ECAP case, the FBI's tip line is available at tips.fbi.gov. The ECAP database is publicly accessible through the FBI's website. The communities that work these cases remain active and welcoming of new members who approach the work with care and commitment. Tonight, allow yourself to breathe. Allow yourself to rest. The work goes on without you while you sleep. But you are part of it now, in the way that anyone who holds this knowledge becomes part of it. Carry it gently. Good night. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?